Today we're counting down 9 of the rarest Mopar muscle cars year by year from 1966 to 1972. But this isn't just a list of rare cars. This is a timeline of how Mopar went from experimenting with performance to building some of the most insane machines the muscle car era has ever seen. By the time we reach 1971, you'll understand why one of these cars is considered the holy grail of all muscle cars. So let's go back to where it all really started. 1966, Dodge Coronet Hemi 4-door sedan, 4 to 5 units built. At first glance, this car makes absolutely no sense because nothing about it looks fast. It's a 4-door sedan, no hood scoop, no aggressive stance, no hint that anything special is going on. It looks like something your dad would drive to work, not something that belongs anywhere near a drag strip. But that's exactly what makes it so crazy, because hidden under that calm, almost forgettable exterior was one of the most feared engines of the entire decade, the 426 Hemi, also known as the Elephant engine. And in 1966, that engine made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. Those are serious numbers, even by today's standards. Now imagine putting that into a full-size 4-door family car. That's exactly what Mopar did, but they didn't build many. In fact, depending on who you ask, only 4, maybe 5, of these cars were ever produced. Out of around 740 Hemi-powered Coronets that year, only a tiny handful were 4-door sedans. This wasn't a marketing experiment. It wasn't meant to be flashy. It existed for one reason: NASCAR. Mopar needed to homologate the Hemi engine for racing, and that meant putting it into production cars. But instead of just building coupes, they quietly slipped it into a sedan. So what you ended up with was one of the earliest sleeper muscle cars ever built. A car that looked completely normal, but could outrun most performance cars of its time. And because it didn't stand out, most people never noticed it. Which makes you wonder, how many of these were out there before people realized what they actually were? Today, tracking them is almost impossible. Chrysler never clearly documented how many 4-door Hemi cars were built, but experts believe only 2, maybe 3, still exist today. That's not just rare, that's almost mythical. One example sold for over $660,000 at auction, and that was years ago. Now imagine pulling up next to one of these at a stoplight in 1966. Would you even think twice? Or would you have just been beaten by a 4-door family car? And if you think Mopar started rare, just wait until you see what happened next. Because in 1967, things got even more extreme. 1967, Dodge Coronet RT Hemi convertible, 3 units built. If the previous car was all about being invisible, this one was the complete opposite. This car didn't try to hide anything. It was bold, aggressive, and built to make a statement. But here's the strange part. Even with all that presence, almost nobody bought one. In 1967, Dodge introduced something new, the RT, short for Road and Track. This was their official entry into the high-performance muscle car war, going head-to-head with the best cars on the road. Most buyers went with the 440 Magnum V8, which already had plenty of power and was much more affordable. But a very small group of buyers wanted more. They wanted the best engine Mopar had, so they checked the box for the 426 Hemi. And then they made an even rarer decision. They ordered it as a convertible, and that combination created one of the rarest Mopars ever built. Only 3. That's it. 3 Hemi-powered Coronet RT convertibles were ever produced. 2 of them came with a 4-speed manual, and 1 came with an automatic. And somehow, all 3 are still known to exist today, which almost never happens with cars this rare. Performance-wise, this thing was a monster. 0 to 60 in about 5.5 seconds and a quarter mile in the mid-13s. But the real reason these cars are so rare comes down to one simple thing: price. Back in 1967, the Hemi engine alone was an expensive option. Now combine that with the cost of a convertible, and suddenly you had one of the most expensive muscle cars you could buy. Most people just couldn't justify it, so they didn't. And because of that, this car became a unicorn. It also didn't rely on flashy styling to stand out. Yes, it had a performance look, but the details were subtle. Small Hemi badges, clean lines, nothing over the top, which means, unless you really knew what you were looking at, you might walk right past one without realizing it was one of the rarest cars Mopar ever built. Today, these cars are considered true collector trophies, and when one shows up at auction, it doesn't just sell, it makes headlines. Now, if you think 3 units is rare, the next car takes a completely different approach to rarity, because this one wasn't just limited, it was experimental. 1968 Dodge Charger 500 prototype, 1 unit built. Now this one is where things start to get a little confusing because technically this car almost didn't exist, at least not in the way most people think. When you hear Charger 500, most people think of the 1969 model, but the real story actually starts in 1968. And it starts with a problem. At high speeds, the standard Charger had terrible aerodynamics. The front grille acted like a parachute, and the rear window design created lift, which made the car unstable at racing speeds. And in NASCAR, that was a big problem, because Ford was starting to dominate, so Dodge needed a solution. And fast, so they built something radical, a one-of-one prototype. This was the 1968 Charger 500 test car, and it looked almost identical to a regular Charger until you looked closer. The deep recessed grille was replaced with a flush-mounted design to smooth out airflow. The rear window was completely reworked, removing the flying buttress design and replacing it with a flush glass panel. These changes might sound small, but at high speeds, they made a massive difference. This wasn't about adding horsepower, it was about cutting through the air, and that single prototype became the foundation for what would come next. Because in 1969, Dodge would turn this concept into a limited production car to meet NASCAR homologation rules. Only a few hundred were built, and even fewer were equipped with the Hemi engine, which makes those cars some of the rarest aero cars in existence today. But it all started with this one experimental machine, a car that was never meant for the public, a car that existed purely to solve a problem, and a car that helped reshape Mopar's entire performance strategy moving forward. Today, that prototype is considered a one-of-one piece of automotive history, not just rare, but irreplaceable. And we're just getting started, because next, we move into one of the most competitive years in muscle car history, and this time, rarity meets luxury in a way almost nobody expected. 1969, Dodge Coronet RT Hemi convertible, 10 units built. By 1969, Mopar wasn't experimenting anymore. They knew exactly how to build a muscle car, and the Coronet RT was one of their best. It had the looks, the performance, and the reputation. But when you combined all of that with a convertible top and the most powerful engine Mopar offered, you ended up with something almost nobody ordered. This is the 1969 Coronet RT Hemi convertible, and it's one of the rarest drop tops Mopar ever built. Only 10. That's it, 10 cars for the entire model year. Out of thousands of Coronet RTs produced, only a handful were ordered as convertibles with the Hemi. And when you break it down even further, it gets even more exclusive. 4 came with a 4-speed manual, and 6 were automatics. And today, experts believe only 4 or 5 of those original 10 still exist. Now here's what makes this car even more interesting. Unlike the Charger or the Super Bee, the Coronet had a much more refined look. It didn't scream performance, it looked mature, almost like a luxury car. But underneath that clean design was the same 426 Hemi, pushing out 425 horsepower. This was a car that blended comfort, style, and raw performance. And that combination came at a price, a big one. By the time you added the Hemi, the RT package, and the convertible option, you were looking at one of the most expensive Mopars you could buy in 1969. So again, most people didn't, and that's exactly why it's so rare today. These cars don't show up often, but when they do, they don't just sell for big money. They remind people how close Mopar came to building the perfect balance between luxury and pure muscle. And if you think 10 units is rare, the next car drops into single digits again. 1970 Dodge Challenger RT Hemi convertible, 9 units built. This is where things get serious, because this isn't just a rare car. This is one of the most valuable muscle cars ever built. In 1970, Dodge introduced the Challenger. It was their answer to the Mustang, the Camaro, and the growing pony car market, and it was a huge success. Over 76,000 Challengers were sold that year, but hidden inside that production number was something incredibly rare. The RT Hemi convertible. To get one, you had to check 3 boxes. First, the RT performance package. Second, the convertible body style. And third, the 426 Hemi. And that combination was insanely expensive. So expensive that almost nobody ordered it. Only 9 were ever built, 5 with a 4-speed manual and 4 with an automatic. That's it. And the performance? Exactly what you'd expect from a Hemi. 0 to 60 in around 6 seconds. And a quarter mile in the low 13s. But numbers don't really tell the full story here. because this car wasn't just about speed, it was about rarity, timing, and survival. Most of these cars lived hard lives. Some were raced, some were modified, and some disappeared completely, which means finding a real numbers-matching example today is almost impossible, and that's why their value has exploded. One of these sold for over $1.6 million at auction. Let that sink in. From a car that almost nobody wanted when it was new, to one of the most valuable Mopars in the world. There's even a famous story about one of them. A dealer sold a Hemi convertible at cost to a friend, just so he could race it and promote the dealership. Years later, the engine and the car were separated, lost, and eventually reunited, which just adds to the legend. This isn't just a car, it's a piece of muscle car history, frozen in time, but somehow it's still not number one because what came next would define an entire era. 1971, Plymouth Hemi-Cuda convertible, 11 units built. This is it, the holy grail, the car that sits at the very top of the muscle car world, the 1971 Hemi-Cuda convertible. By this point, the muscle car era was starting to collapse. Insurance costs were rising, emissions regulations were tightening, and the Hemi engine was on its way out, which meant very few people were willing to spend big money on a high-performance convertible. And that's exactly why this car is so rare. Depending on the source, only 11, maybe 12, were ever built, and only a handful were sold in the United States. The rest were export cars. Now combine that rarity with one of the most aggressive designs Mopar ever produced, and you get something truly special. The 1971 Cuda had a one-year-only look, quad headlights, fender gills, massive billboard stripes, and the iconic shaker hood that literally moved with the engine. It didn't just look aggressive, it looked alive. And under that hood was the same 426 Hemi, 425 horsepower, 490 pound-feet of torque, a race engine in a street car. Even by modern standards, this thing demands respect. And today, it demands something else too. Millions. One of these sold for $3.5 million, and values today are even higher, depending on condition and originality. That makes this not just one of the rarest Mopars ever built, but one of the most valuable American cars, period. Now, you might think nothing could top the Hemi-Cuda, but the next car isn't about being the best, it's about being the last. 1972, Plymouth Road Runner GTX 446 pack, 1 to 3 units built. By 1972, everything was changing. The golden age of muscle cars was coming to an end. New emissions laws, rising insurance costs, and shifting buyer preferences were killing off big engines. And Mopar knew it, so instead of continuing the GTX as its own model, they turned it into an option. If you wanted a GTX in 1972, you had to order it on a Road Runner, and if you really knew what you were doing, you went for the 446 pack, 3 two-barrel carburetors, feeding a massive big block V8. But here's the catch. This engine option didn't last long. It was only available for a very short time, before being pulled from production. And because of that, only 1, maybe 2, were ever built. That's how rare this car is. There is only one fully documented numbers-matching example known to exist today, one, and that makes it one of the rarest Mopars of all time. Now, on paper, the horsepower numbers dropped this year, not because the engines got weaker, but because manufacturers switched from gross horsepower ratings to net ratings. So the 440 was now rated at around 330 horsepower. But don't let that fool you. This was still a serious performance machine. It still had the torque, the presence, and the attitude of a true muscle car. But it also represented something else. The end. This was one of the last true high-compression Mopar engines before the era changed forever. And that gives it a completely different kind of value. Not just rare, but symbolic. So now I want to know, which one of these rare Mopars surprised you the most? And if you're enjoying this deep dive into rare muscle cars, make sure you subscribe.